nice start. So, live stream is on, and it's, I guess we're starting for class 1 for section 1201 Triennial Rulemaking hearings. My name is Reagan Smith, and I'm the Deputy General Counsel of the Copyright Office. We're here for the next 2 hours to talk about whether the current temporary regulatory exemptions for certain uses of audiovisual works should be expanded or modified, and this will build upon both the written comments everyone has submitted as well as the hearings we held in DC 2 weeks ago. So we will ask you to focus on hearing those issues rather than repeating things that have already been said, just so we can continue to build out the record. Before we get started, a couple of reminders. First is there's a sign-up sheet in the back if anyone wishes to speak on any other class, write a couple of minutes of comments. We call this audience participation, and that will be tomorrow, Wednesday. We're going to start it at 1:30 as opposed to 2:30. But feel free to sign up if that's something that interests you. And then secondly, for the panelists, if you wish to speak, just put your placard up and we'll call on you. And when you do speak, if you can repeat your name for the reporter, that would be helpful. There were some issues yesterday with understanding who was talking because your backs are facing him. So I think we're going to start out with everyone introducing each other, themselves and their affiliations, and then we have a couple of presentations.
I'm Stacy Cheney, a senior attorney advisor at NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Good morning.
John Riley, Copyright Office.
Anna Chabet, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Julie Saltman, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Mr. Hunter?
Hi, I'm Jack Lerner, I'm Director of the UCI Intellectual Property Arts and Technology Clinic at UC Irvine Law School. I'm here on behalf of Joint Filmmakers, Film International Documentary Association, Films, as well as the ebook authors for Class 1, Authors Alliance, American Association of University Professors, and others. I'm here mostly to answer questions and provide clarification where needed today.
I'm Tisha Turk. I'm an English professor at the University of Minnesota at Morris. I'm also a video remix artist, and I'm a member of the Organization for Transforming Works, so I'm here on behalf of the
Everybody, good morning. My name is Art Neal. I'm the Executive Director of New Media Rights. I'm here representing New Media Rights as well as our partners, EPFF and OTW, in regards to the streamlined exemption proposal that we put forward. So, good morning.
I'm Betsy Rosenblatt, Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Intellectual Property Law at Whittier Law School. In addition to being an IP law professor, I am also the legal chair of the Organization for Transformative Works, and I'm here on behalf of the Organization for Transformative Works, which submitted 2 exemption requests, one for the streamlined request and the other relating to multimedia ebooks.
Hi, Matt Williams from MSK. I'm representing AAP, ESA, MPAA, and RIAA. Thank you.
Ben Schaffner with the Motion Picture Association of America.
David Taylor, counsel to the DVD CCA and AACSLA.
Okay, thank you everyone and welcome. I think we're going to start off, we have 2 presentations regarding screen capture technology. So we'll start with Professor Kirk, and this will be Exhibit 1G. And so all these exhibits, including the ones from DC, will be posted on the website in the next week or 2 shortly, which should be able to go back and forth.
Would you like me to introduce the clip?
Sure.
What do you hear that? So this is 30 seconds from the first episode of the TV show The Magicians, captured from, this must have been from Netflix, to illustrate some of the potential problems with using screen capture for the next video.
And so what program did you use to capture this?
Move AVI, which says that it is not for capturing copyrighted video, incidentally, but I did it anyway. So there are several things to note about this clip, right? Even leaving aside the trial watermark, which obviously we've got to be there when we're using the full version of the program. The stuttering, the jerkiness, the pause when the streaming has a glitch, and so we just have a long still frame and then it jumps ahead several seconds. These are the kinds of things that make captured clips fine for just watching, but not suitable for, not aesthetically suitable for artists.
And you're saying that the stuttering wouldn't be there with the not trial version?
I have no idea, I haven't used the non-trial version. I was talking about the giant red watermark that says demo version. You have to sort of ignore that. I wasn't willing to pay money for this program, so. They had a 7-day free trial, which I used. So that's, I have other examples of other problems, but I think that's What? Yeah, no, I mean, it was only a 30-second clip, so.
Okay.
Do you know if that had to circumvent TPM in order to capture, or was that just a straight capture without TPM, or breaking it?
I have no idea how screen capture technology works, so I can't tell you that. All I know is that I downloaded the program, followed the directions, loaded up an episode of TV, set the dimensions to capture the actual image, which, side note, is not a standard, it results in a non-standard frame size. It would be very difficult for me to load that into an editing program and not have it have to either upscale or downscale or do something else. The frame size is not, for example, the standard Blu-ray frame size dimensions, which is a separate set of, that's a set of technical problems on top of the aesthetic problems.
I also noticed it didn't have sound. Was that an issue with this, or did you just elect not?
Oh no, I just didn't want you all to have to listen to me swearing at the program. So when I capture for bidding purposes, I would never use the sound. The whole point is that we we provide a separate soundtrack. So I would never capture the sound. Other people might for other purposes.
Some bidders would use sound, right?
Some bidders would, yes. Some bidders do incorporate bits of dialogue into the videos that they make. But for that can be distracting, right? Especially if there's background music, it can create all sorts of problems with the music that you're actually providing as a bidder. So yes, I think some people would, but since it was not necessary for this purpose.
And then the editing program, what editing program do you typically use to make the remix video?
I use Adobe Premiere.
Okay, and is Adobe Premiere, can it, I guess, ingest both the Blu-ray frame size dimensions and this program, or you would have to convert it, or?
I have to admit, I do not have Adobe Premiere on the machine that I have with me, and so I was not able to load this clip into Adobe Premiere and see what would happen with it. With this specific clip, I can say that based on my past experience, Adobe Premiere can load almost anything as long as the codec is okay. Where you run into problems is editing, especially if you're capturing and everything is a slightly different size, right? So combining clips and then exporting at the end of the process can be a little tricky. But at this point, the software is advanced. The problem isn't usually importing. The problem is editing and exporting.
And just to confirm, when you're using Adobe Premiere, that's for when you're not using screen capture, that's for when you're circumventing
Either.
It's in either circumstance then?
I don't use screen captured clips. I use our exemption and rip from Blu-ray or from DVDs. Increasingly from Blu-ray because it's prettier, but there are a few things that I only have on DVD.
All right, is there anything else you'd like to show us?
I think that will do for now, actually.
I have another question. You said this was from Netflix, you thought. Is that more difficult to catch the streaming versus capturing something from a DVD or a Blu-ray for the technology?
Is it more difficult?
Right. So you said, for example, that there was perhaps interruption. Maybe there was some slowing in the loading of the Netflix video on your machine that may have caused some of the jerkiness to the. Is that a fair assessment of perhaps maybe one of the dilemmas here?
Yeah, I think that's fair, that if you're capturing something that's streaming, it's going to be more prone to glitches because there are potentially problems with the internet connection, right? As opposed to if you are capturing, so if you're streaming from iTunes, if you're streaming from Netflix, if you're streaming from Amazon Prime, that creates an additional layer of difficulty as opposed to if you're streaming, as if you're capturing, say, a Blu-ray that's playing on your computer. Though it's worth noting that many computers do not have optical discs at this point, so if someone were going to use screen capture, whether they would bother buying a Blu-ray or a DVD is, I think, an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I do purchase DVDs and Blu-rays, and so that's what I use.
Well, if you wanted to get the DVD or the Blu-ray, would you also need a player?
Sorry?
That you need the optional player.
Yes, and I have one. I mean, that's my point. I am able to use those things precisely because that's my setup. I've been using that for years.
Mr. Taylor?
David Taylor. I would just point out that if I were to pick a screen capture program and try to record it for the first time, I would probably end up with the same result that she did. Every program requires you to learn about it and learn what's the best optimal.
Oh.
Every screen capture program requires you to learn what are the optimal settings for that program. And as well, what kind of machine are you using to capture it? The programs that we have introduced all have resolution settings on them where you can set the screen size if you want it for DVD or if you want it for HD. Also, another problem with that is that it was streamed, and you don't know what the internet connection is. Another problem is that I don't know what was the codex that was being used to record. Was it lossy or was it lossless? And the lossy format is going to require a certain amount of compression. And you just aren't always going to be able to sit down, use a screen capture program for the first time and get the most perfect result. You will have to spend time learning its ins and outs. But the ones that we have offered fairly compensate for everything that she described to be a problem.
So are you familiar with the program that Professor Turk is using?
I'm not. I'm familiar with the ones that we have had to learn. I've had to learn screen capture programs every 3 years now, and just have not come across that one.
It sounds like there's a variety out there.
Oh, there are infinite numbers of programs. And I would also say that screen capture programs are much easier to learn than Handbrake and video editing that is required. So anybody that is a hobbyist who's doing video editing can easily spend the time to learn how best to maximize the results from screen capture program.
So I think, just stop you there because we're gonna let you do a presentation next, but I'll just let Mr. Lerner wanted to speak to Professor Turner's presentation.
Just wanted to make two small points. One is that Stu Morissette noted in the statement, which is attached to the joint filmmakers' comment from December, there are many sound difficulties. There's a question about sound, difficulties with syncing the sound. There's often computer noise that's important as well. And of course, sometimes there are stereo effects and other important parts of the sound that are not captured by screen capture. Also, I was surprised to hear that there's an allegation that there would be lossless screen capture. Our research indicates that no screen capture can capture all the frames in a Blu-ray. What they do is they compensate it. Maybe that lossless may be used here to refer to the highest possible fidelity. But our contention is that we have not been able to find a screen capture program that does not drop frames and lead to stuttering and other problems. But we'd be happy to take a look at this video and the one that's, in fact, we request to be able to take a look at this video and the one that was shown in April, in here on April 11th, and comment on that.
Professor Rosenblatt, did you have a comment on Professor Turk's clip?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, please.
A few responses actually to questions posed to Professor Turk. One is that Move AVI is among the popular screen capture softwares. There are several, but Move AVI is a popular one. In response to the question that does screen capture require or involve circumvention of technological protection measures, nobody knows. Which is one of the issues with an exemption that deals with making a distinction between screen capture and ripping for these purposes. Another comment on Netflix. This stream was from Netflix, but we have the OTW reports that many who have tried to use screen capture technologies from Netflix end up with just a black screen rather than any visual at all, which makes, and this is true for other DRM measures as well, that there are certain sources from which screen capture is simply inadequate. As to whether screen capture from streaming is different. It's necessary to use streaming for some things because that is streaming is often the only or most timely source for materials, and so saying that one could have an internet lag free screen capture is true only for some materials. Resetting the screen size, which was suggested as an option, results not only in difficulty loading into editing programs, but also loss of material. For example, on the size of the screen, screen capture uses the aspect ratio of whatever computer you're working on. So there may be material lost at the edges of screens. From resetting screen sizes, this is something that Professor Turk can speak to with other clips that she's brought. And finally, to the extent that the stutter in that was a result of internet lag, that is something that happened to have been done using a high-speed DSL connection in a Los Angeles home. There are lots of people with less reliable internet connections. But even in a perfect internet connection situation, there is frame loss and blurring that is an inevitable result of using screen capture.
All right, Mr. Taylor, if you want to give your presentation, and then Mr. Williams, if it's short, you can say now or you can go on.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of directly respond to something that was just said. I mean, the relevance of screen capture at this point largely goes to whether the existing exemption beneficiaries have to make a good faith effort to use it to get the quality that they need before moving ahead with circumvention. And we talked about this some in Washington, and you had asked me what's the point of including that in the exemptions, and why refer to screen capture at all if it may or may not be legal. And we just heard, I think, the reason why that happened. It's because the proponents have consistently questioned whether it's legal or not and said we can't use it because we don't know if it's legal. So that's why you've included it, and that's why I think you should retain it. And largely the relevance of screen capture at this point goes to that issue. There's only one, I think, category of users in the existing regulations that can only use screen capture, and there's nothing in this record about K through 12 students needing to use anything more than screen capture.
I think proponents are sort of split as to whether the screen capture exemption is helpful or hurtful, because some of them was asked to get rid of it, and some it's confusing, and some have asked to keep it. So, Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, I think.
So this is going to be Exhibit 1H.
Hello, my name is Rachel Samara. I am currently a code technician for a major media company in the Washington, D.C. area. At my job, I am responsible for building XML plays to support the transcoding of mezzanine files into various formats, complying with but not limited to online VOD and DVD standards. I am also responsible for quality control evaluation of all file outputs and derivatives, and preparing these files and submitting for their final delivery. So you can see that what I'm doing right now is I've imported the 3 clips that were requested for evaluation into Adobe Premiere. These 3 files are actually not the original files that I was given. They were in an AVI format, which is becoming obsolete, so I transcoded it into an MP4 format. I was asked to determine if these clips would be usable as a deliverable, and the answer is no. However, if only a small excerpt from one of these clips is used in a larger project, providers will accept the deliverable as a whole. When working on a larger project, you are very likely to use multiple sources with multiple frame rates. When you put all these clips together on one timeline, you just need to make sure that they are all one uniform frame rate. The best way to decide which frame rate to use is you go with the frame rate that is used by the majority of your sources. That way, only a few pieces of your source material will have to be converted. The hope is that all of your converted material will look acceptable. From my experience, Apple for iTunes is the pickiest of the providers that my company generally delivers to. And they have accepted deliverables where there are some mixed cadences from conversions in the deliverable. There just can't be a large amount of them. Using this clip as an example, it is from a show that was originally shot in 2398. The clip I have here is a 5994 conversion. Chances are, if you are putting together a project in the United States, your project will probably be 5994 interlace, or 2997 progressive, or 2398 PSF. So this clip is ready to go if it is for a 5994 project. If you were to use it for a 2997 project, you would just need to convert it to 2997. Now, if you have this clip and not the original source, and your project is in 2398, you would have to do something called an inverse telesyncing. What that is basically a backwards conversion to return it to its native frame rate. Again, as long as the clip that you have has the same format as the remaining clips in your project, it will be usable. Even if it is not native frame rate, as long as it is only a small portion of the project. Thank you.
So, what we had delivered to her was screen capture that we did with the OBS, and OBS offers a lossless format. And does it drop frames? Yes.
It drops frames, not the lossless.
Well, they call it a lossless format. Is it frame per frame? If you lined it up, is it exact? No, it's not. I'm not going to make that representation. But for a screen capture that's recording, it's picking up 9 out of 10 of those frames. And there's a lot of frames there. So what we delivered to her is not the same quality that we had originally submitted to you, because there was a learning curve for us and figuring out what they advertised as lossless. When you do it, results in a huge file. So it's not something that most people are going to choose to use. But if you really are looking for high quality screen capture, the OBS system delivers something that somebody who works for Discovery and delivers these products has said, this could be included in a final product. Is it in itself, by itself with nothing around it, a deliverable. No, it's not. But when it's just a small piece, as all of the exemptions are entitled to being, then it is perfectly fine. And we've known this. Every work requires some amount of post-production editing, and nobody gets this perfect clip and is instantly able to, distribute it to the movie theaters. No, they have to process it. And, this is somebody who evaluates clips. She looked at our clips, she said what it honestly was, and we believe that, screen capture can even serve the purposes of filmmakers.
Well, I guess let's just be clear. I mean, the register found in the 2015 rulemaking that there were certain instances where screen capture was not a reliable alternative, which is why like, there's some, for some of the exemptions, like for close analysis for filmmaking, screen capture isn't. So I just want to clarify, like that's the baseline that we're working from today.
And I would say that we have now presented evidence that goes a little bit further that says that screen capture has improved to the extent that you can deliver a product that will meet distribution standards. Whether or not it is the close analysis, that isn't the specific question that I asked this expert to opine on.
She's saying, well, so you can put it on iTunes, right?
She's saying that iTunes-
Apple is the pickiest,
Is the
iTunes,
pickiest.
that's the distribution platform, I think that she was here to that, unless there's.
Yes, but we talked extensively about PBS and Netflix, and she's like, they don't matter, it's all about iTunes.
Okay, but you seem to be admitting that it's deliverable as a whole, that it's okay that there are imperfections in screen clips that are being used.
Yes, I mean, that is, and that's always been the case with any documentary film that's used archive clips. You've never been, if you're using an archive clip, it was, film, and it was from the 40s or 20s, and it always has to be processed to be included in modern distribution media.
Okay, Ms. Turk, or sorry, Professor Turk.
I just wanted to clarify something about codecs, because you were asking about lossless and drop frames. And a codec is just what it's the format in which something is encoded or decoded. So something can be encoded with a lossless codec, but all it can encode is the data stream that it is fed. So it can encode a stream that has dropped frames that is pixelated or whatever.
Mr. Neal?
Yes, I just wanted to add one point related to quality and the use of screen capture, and just relate the fact and point to the record of the client that we mentioned in the joint at OTW and in our comments, where just from personal knowledge, working with people on distribution contracts with broadcasters and with online service providers, I certainly have had people sent back to the table and told to, even if it was an older clip, sent back and told to get the source material, use the source material, if possible. And it's important to note that what happens practically there. Most of the folks that are getting, say, contracts related to nonfiction, documentary, or short films, things like that, these contracts are not huge contracts to begin with. The licensing fees are fairly modest. So if you're told to return, to have to recut your video, to find the source material clips, that takes time and it takes money, and it does eat into the small fees those folks use to even subsist and do their work. Also, the other point is that related, upscaling certainly isn't sufficient, and there's actual, Netflix has standards relating to upscaling where they say, upscaling isn't going to be acceptable. So I think it's a bit far-fetched to say that distributors are just accepting across the board. I mean, they certainly want to put the best quality material forward, and they will ask a filmmaker to go back to get source material, so that does happen.
So that's helpful. Do you, or can you point to specific examples in the record, or can you give specific examples of specific films where that has happened?
Sure, we have an example in our reply comments. I can give you the precise page of the client that was sent back by a broadcaster to have to go get source material because it wasn't high enough quality.
And just to confirm that it wasn't high enough quality because screen capture was used when it was originally given to the distributor.
That was a screen captured clip, yes.
Right, Mr. Norman?
Thank you. I want to stress that this video mentions only getting the frame rate correct, but there are many, many other flaws that are introduced, many, many other problems that could cause a clip to be rejected. If you look at Appendix B of our December comment for the joint filmmakers, you can see documentary evidence of this, as well as evidence about broadcast standards. Mr. Taylor asserted that PBS and Netflix don't matter. However, to nearly all independent documentary filmmakers, PBS and Netflix absolutely do matter. They're extremely important. Netflix is perhaps the most important distribution site. So I'd like the record to, I just want to point out that the record here is only referring to iTunes, and he said that this does not apply to PBS and Netflix. We have discussed in this proceeding and before that, and in our filings, that that PBS and Netflix have very rigorous standards. And we have not been able to find any screen capture program, including OBS, which we addressed in our comments, that actually works. OBS does not work. A couple of other quick comments. As far as archival footage, absolutely, if you have an old video from the 70s, from a news footage or whatever it might be, that will be accepted. But that's because broadcasters understand that there's absolutely nothing else available. If you try to submit a modern clip, that will be rejected. And finally, I just want to point out that no documentary evidence has been submitted by the opposition about broadcast standards, whereas we have done that in 2015 and again in the 2017-2018 proceeding. And also, it's not clear who this expert is, what her qualifications are. She's not available for us to ask questions, and I'm not even sure where she's employed. Whereas Jim Morissette, who's been a technical director of one of the leading independent film companies in the country for over 40 years, made himself available in a previous hearing on April 11th.
Also that I would say he's represented, she's employed at Discovery, and this is what she works in, and we see the filmmakers provide a variety of examples from filmmakers of things they want to do, and we don't require them all to come here and testify, so.
Oh, okay. Understood. Thank you.
Ms. Rosenblatt?
Thank you. I just want to point out a brief sort of inconsistency in the arguments here, which is that to the extent that many, including we, argue that screen capture is not circumvention and therefore shouldn't even require an exemption at all, the argument that the quality of screen capture is high enough for everything is fundamentally inconsistent with the argument that DRM is necessary to prevent piracy. And we would rebut that by saying that, in fact, pirates don't need high quality, artists do. And that to the extent we're asking people who make art and commentary to sacrifice their artistic vision, we're asking too much of them, and we're turning the Copyright Office into art critics.
Thank you.
That is a helpful perspective, but I mean, we're not here to discuss whether DRM is valuable or not valuable generally, right? We're just administering the rulemaking under the standards where we have regulatory authority to act or not act. So that's, what we're focused on. So, Mr. Williams?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to return to the question that you asked earlier about, well, in the 2015 proceeding, certain baseline was established. And I think we didn't oppose renewal of the existing exemptions unless you start changing the language, they will be renewed as is. And so I guess what's at issue here is does David's presentation speak to any of the requested expansions? And I think that it does in this way. For multiple cycles now, fictional filmmakers, fictional ebook authors, and commercial video makers have had a hard time establishing under the law that their uses are non-infringing. And I think that's still true under the existing record, and we can talk more about that. But when you compare that with the quality of screen capture, and it's kind of hard because the room had a lot of light in it, so we couldn't see. But I think what we saw in Washington was that the quality is pretty good, and I think what this video shows is that's true as well, and that experts are capable of using it to achieve their purposes. And so I think that you should take it into account when you're comparing, okay, we've got this kind of blurry issue of whether any of these uses have established their non-infringing status versus can they achieve this practically? And if they can, then certainly the legal issue shouldn't weigh in their favor when they haven't been able to meet the burden. And I did just want to point out, I think you kind of addressed this, but for Jack to say that, well, that expert, we haven't provided enough information, we've been dealing with anonymous sources in this proceeding from the beginning, and every year the proponents submit anonymous sources. There are some in their filings, so I don't see how that could undermine the credibility of what David was saying.
I have a question, Mr. Williams, if you don't mind. I know that Mr. Taylor's waiting there. It's interesting in the formulation of the current exemption that basically asks the person producing the film to go through the screen capture process first. Do you envision that rule requires them to go all the way to rejection, as Mr. Neal indicated, or is there perhaps before they go to some other version, as the rule indicates, right, that if that's not good enough quality, then they can use the circumvention? Do you envision that has to go all the way to rejection as talked about by Mr. Neal, or is there some intermediate sort of review and say, hey, this is not going to be good enough, we can reject it before we go on to further production? What do you think about?
Sure. I think it's a good faith standard, and it's meant to be kind of a common sense standard, and so I don't think it requires going through to rejection in every instance. I do think it requires sampling enough of the products on the marketplace to figure out which ones work best. And if you're working with a PBS, for example, and you've used the best product you can find, and in the past you've been rejected, or if you compare the standards technically to what they're saying you have to submit, then you've made a good faith effort. You wouldn't have to do that every single time, or you wouldn't have to submit something that you know is going to get rejected and slow down your project. So I guess that's how I would read the existing language.
So in the example that Mr. Neal gave, then that author potentially, now that they've been rejected by that particular broadcaster, they may not have to go back and use the screen capture again. They would just be able to go right into the circumvention and use the tools that they have available then.
I think that would be a common sense approach, although I don't recall the specifics of that one individual example. I don't know whether that was a ebook involving film analysis, or whether it was one that wouldn't be eligible under the existing exemption.
Yeah, and I don't know that he gave us enough information for that, but if it were one of those that fit under
right,
it would seem that would be enough.
Yeah, I think stay abreast of what's available as new things come out, try them out, see what works best, and then make a good faith effort. There's a lot of standards that require good faith efforts, and the contracts do it all the time, and people manage to operate under that. I do think that Ms. Rosenblatt's comments again underscore why the office decided to include references to screen capture in the regulations, and why it does serve some purpose. It both makes it clear that there is an obligation to make these good faith efforts, but it also says that if a product is marketed in a way that makes the consumer believe that it is not a circumvention device, then they're covered. If that product turns out to be a circumvention device, they're eligible anyway for the exemption.
They would not be prosecuted for circumvention if they were to use it in this case.
Right, there's an exemption for it.
Mr. Taylor and then Mr. Reimer.
David Taylor. I just want to say that I have not said that PBS and I certainly didn't mean to say PBS and Netflix standards don't count. what I said was that in my discussions with the expert, I had her look at the DBS and Netflix standards, and she offered that in her experience of working with those companies, the most difficult of companies is iTunes, is Apple's. So that's all I'm saying here. Also, I do want to affirm Mr. Williams' comments about the significance of screen capture at this point in the proceeding, that it really is an alternative for those opportunities or those people looking to expand the exemptions. And to that extent, all we're saying is that screen capture has improved significantly and continues to improve. So, yeah, that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Lerner.
Thank you. Very quickly, I want to respond to something that Matt said regarding the use of anonymous film, introduction of anonymous filmmakers. It's true that some of our filmmakers wish to keep their name anonymous. They are our clients, people that we know. And I think there's a difference between saying that someone's an expert and presenting a video that person created and introducing one among dozens of filmmakers or numerous authors. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Thank you.
Thank you. We've spent a lot of time talking about the filmmaking exemption. Very quickly, Mr. Taylor had an exhibit in the DC hearings, Exhibit 1B, which showed the iBook author being used for ebooks. So I wanted to give Ms. Rosenblatt an opportunity to refer to that to see if there's anything she has to say about like why screen capture would not have been a suitable alternative in that instance.
For multimedia ebooks, I think it depends entirely on what you are doing. There are probably some uses for which screen capture is absolutely adequate, and there are some for which it is not. One of the things that we've seen, again, mostly through anonymous sources who choose not to put themselves on the record as possibly violating the law for understandable reasons, say that what they want to do is to be able to make seamless stories that incorporate material from multiple sources. It's difficult to do that when you're dealing with different frame rates, different screen sizes, that sort of thing. Also, if what you want to do is really focus in on a particular aspect of something that you're using, as we've heard some of Professor Lerner's clients discuss, they simply cannot do that dependably using something that's going to result in loss of the sides of screens or blurry material. To say that every single possible use needs to be a fair use is, I think, asking too much. To say that there's a significant possibility that fair use would be chilled is what we're here to do, and I think that's something that is within the realm of what we're establishing.
And one other question I wanted to ask is, can you speak to any examples where a person engaging in circumvention is confused about whether or not they reasonably believe that screen capture is not an alternative to circumvention?
So this is something that I'd actually like Professor Turk to address directly after me, but I will note some interesting statistics about what we mean when we say this is a law that has more effect on what happens after someone makes something than on what happens before they make something. So in February 2017, the OTW conducted a survey of about 3,000 fans. We posted on our website, hey, we have a survey, and people came and did it. 1,845 responded to a question asking what the DMCA was. Of these, 1,400, so way more than half, either said they had not heard of the DMCA or that they did not know what it was. Of the 440 who said that they did know what the DMCA was, only 67 said anything at all about it, including anti-circumvention. Of these, a grand total of 6 mentioned the exemptions. But about as many use words like complicated, confusing, and convoluted. So those who do know what it is find it complicated, confusing, and convoluted. The people who actually sort of knew something about it had narrative responses like, I have little understanding of this due to the confusing and vague language. I believe the language of the act is deliberately confusing. Haha, it's a protection of digital copyright infringement that scared the pants off of everyone in my middle school. This is the sort of user we're dealing with who finds this very confusing. That may not address directly your question, but it speaks to, I think, what we're talking about when we say that the exemption is confusing and that people are unlikely to seek out something that they know isn't going to work as well when there's an option out there that, from the consumer standpoint, works and they won't have to go through these multiple steps. They don't understand why doing one thing would be infringing and doing another thing wouldn't, when, if what they're doing is fair use for criticism and commentary, that they don't understand why those things would be different.
Thank you. So those statistics are very interesting and helpful, but I want to, hearing you say that this is not about what happens, this is about what happens after you make something than before you make something, seems a tension with what you said before, which is that there's a chill upon uses. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So there is a chill on uses from people who do know about the law.
But it sounds like that's very few people and everyone is still making the thing.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. But in circumstances where people really do want to find out what the law is and do the research, they're going to be chilled. A lot of the trouble with this comes in when someone who isn't chilled because they don't know about the law then has to interact with an institution like a school or a traditional publisher or a library who has who won't facilitate their work, who won't adopt their work, or when you have to talk to a lawyer, whether it's responding to a takedown or trying to get insured, that's where this chilling effect will happen, not in the initial creativity standpoint, but in the context of when you actually want to use what you've made. So it turns the law into a trap for the unwary, essentially. And it makes fair uses more vulnerable to takedown. The main reason that this is a barrier is because when you encounter a gatekeeper, like an iTunes, for example, it can turn out that what you've done is illegal, even when it would have been perfectly legal if you'd used a different program.
So, obviously, in your comments for OTW and NMR and EFF, you say that this is kind of confusing, that's why we should have these streamlined, kind of eliminate distinctions based on use and user. So is it really just because people don't know if they can do screen capture or not? Is that the confusion that you're talking about?
There are a few levels of confusion. One is that they don't know whether they can use screen capture. Another is that they don't know what non-commercial means. For example, if you have something that you're putting up on YouTube and someone's going to be putting ads against it, is that commercial or not?
This is the third time we've talked about the non-commercial remix video category, right? And I think YouTubers have always been sort of contemplating that, but not trying to monetize it. Is how real is that confusion? Because that seems like something we can consider and provide somebody to clear up.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
I mean, how real is that confusion? Because I think the non-commercial limitation came from things OTW itself submitted, so it's sort of surprising to hear now that non-commercial is posing a difficulty in understanding how to use the exemptions?
So I actually think that times have changed a little bit regarding the way content is delivered, in the sense that non-commerciality, in the sense of whether somebody is personally making money off of their creation, is now, it's just more complicated to know whether that's going to happen when you post something. I think the OTW is still very much about non-commercial creation, and that's our focus. But we've had increasingly people come to us confused about what non-commercial means, and that's something that's happened in the last
The
6 years.
filmmaking and ebook exemptions are not limited by commerciality, so.
Correct.
Are you proposing that they should be or should not be, or?
We're proposing no change to those.
Mr. Williams?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we tried to say in our filing that we support trying to make things simple and understandable, but I don't think you can do it at the expense of following the law, looking at the record, applying the case law and the statute to it, and then designing regulations that comply with the instructions that you received from Congress on what to do here. And I think even if you took the language that EFF proposed as simplified, if you run it through these search engines that they used in their comments to try to judge the level of education you would need to understand it properly, you still get a college age education level. They said what we proposed was graduate school level, but it's difficult to craft legal regulations that I think in those search engines, which I don't know how they operate exactly, would come out at something below a college level. But I think it's important that you do follow the case law, and even if you look at, for example, some of the work that Michael Donaldson has done, one of the things that he says, he's tried to simplify the fair use standard, as I understand it, to kind of 3 bullet points instead of 4. And the third one is, would your use be clear to the average viewer? And I think if you apply that to most of the examples in the record, if not almost all of them, the fair use nature of it does not come through. Often the point of the use is not clearly perceivable to the average viewer. And so that's why I think you've drawn the lines where you've drawn them with respect to filmmaking and with respect to ebook authorship. There's a number of cases on this. We cite to the Axonar case involving use of Star Trek in a fan film, as it was referred to. There was no payment to be charged there, and the court still said that that's not a fair use. It said there that the point of the work could not readily be perceived. To the court, it felt a lot more like just kind of a celebration of Star Trek in a use to get attention of fans instead of a parody. So I do think you have to be really careful where you draw the lines, and I think you've done a good job of that. The non-commercial videos, I think that should be retained to non-commercial. 3 years ago, there was an effort to make it primarily non-commercial, and the evidence didn't satisfy you that should be done. Now they're trying to go all the way to commercial, and I think there's actually fewer examples of commercial remix videos in the record this time than there was last time. Of course, commerciality does make a big difference, that's true. Even if, for example, licensing is not available. There's a case, Dr. Seuss Enterprises versus Comic Mix, and I pulled the 2-pager summary from the Copyright Office database of fair use. And there they found that although there was a transformative purpose, under the 4th factor, the case failed, and the fair use defense failed as a matter of law, because there's potential harm under the 4th factor to derivative works, even if they had not established that they had licensed mashups. So I think that the lines have been drawn carefully. The law is not quite as simple as some folks would like it to be, but that doesn't mean that you should discard it and just write the simplest regulation.
So there's a lot of factors that which we'll get to, but since we, just to stick with you for one more
Yes.
question, then maybe people can respond to, the full of Mr. Williams' explanation. But there are some examples of specific types of ebooks that, individuals would like to create that would not arguably follow, well, I guess arguably may or may not fall within the ebooks example. Do you want to comment upon those, whether you think they fall within the existing exemption, or whether if they were non-commercial in a similar way to the remix videos, whether you think they would qualify as variants?
I think I'd have to go through them one by one. Most of the ebooks examples that I recall seem to fit kind of into the ebooks category. The things like the digital Dubliners book seemed like an ebook to me. So I don't recall the specific examples that were right on the line, but I'd have to go through them one by one.
Okay, I do, I'm gonna comment, but I do also wanna ask, because we talked about how the language is confusing, so my question is, rather than eliminating distinctions based on user, would it be possible just to clarify the regulatory language to make it, to give more guidance? And so, Professor Turk, you've had your elaborate up for a while, so if you could maybe respond to that, and then any other comments you have.
I feel like as the only non-lawyer in the room, I'm not sure how much I should weigh in on
Well,
the
then
language
maybe
question.
you're actually be the best person, because you're representing a group of people who are not lawyers, but who may have to look to this for guidance when they can use or develop an ebook or a film.
So, here's the thing about the remix community. We use what works. And so, from my point of view, I mean, I have to say that when I was reading and trying to parse all the various comments that were being filed, I deal with complicated language, but not this kind of complicated language. So that was a little bit of a heavy lift for me. I was sort of mystified that screen capture came up at all. I couldn't sort of understand why that was even in the things that I was reading, because the goal for a remix artist is to get good quality video onto the computer. And I guess I didn't understand why anybody would be asked to use something that usually doesn't work as well. We had a little bit of an exchange about this earlier. Does something have to go all the way to the point of failure before you say, well, I should try something else? Can't you just know from past experience or from other people's experience that this typically doesn't work, and there's a thing that does work and works really well, and there's a whole community that's built up around trading info about how to use this kind of source, which is not, putting Blu-ray is not uncomplicated, but it's straightforward, and it gives you a file that goes into a program easily and can be worked with. And so I guess I don't understand why we can't just say, if it's fair use, get the video in a way that works for you, go. Maybe I'm missing something, but I guess from my point of view, if someone wants to use screen capture, I would never say, don't use screen capture. I wouldn't do it, because in my experience, it doesn't work very well. There might be cases where someone wants to do it or needs to do it, but I'm interested in the end result. I'm interested in, can I make the point that I want to make? Is the quality going to be clear enough that someone's not going to immediately hit the back button? And we have evidence that shows that because video quality is going up and because people are watching things on bigger TVs and screen resolution is higher, if something looks amateurish, people don't watch it.
Can I ask you for a second, since you're here as a remix person and the non-lawyer at the table, can you speak to remix and educational sessions? Because we had a professor in DC talking about K-12 remix activities. She thought that screen capture might be perfectly adequate. Do you have any insight into that?
It might be. I mean, I don't know. I haven't taught remix in those kinds of settings. So I guess again, I come back to, I would never want to disallow that. If someone thinks that works, that's great. But I wouldn't want to impose that on people who have, whose workflow or the access to the technology that they have or whatever
works better with a different format.
Mr. Taylor?
Yes, I just wanted, from the last hearing, you had asked us whether or not we had any ideas on this, and we kind of just looked at you like deer in the headlights. We have since gone back to the clients, and we're glad to be, or happy to report that we are able to endorse the Joint Creators proposal for simplifying the regulatory language. I personally feel that the regulatory language that we have there is an amazing improvement over the actual statute and the exemptions that are created there by Congress. So, I mean, I don't think that what you've done is very difficult to understand, particularly once you start looking at it. I think that maybe you may want to consider, if it's so confusing for people, is to actually provide them some examples of what the activities would look like. There are many regulatory agencies that are now actually providing, like, well, if you're doing it like this, then you can do this. And so it actually walk people through some of the uses that have actually been presented in this rulemaking.
Mr. Lee?
Okay, just a couple of comments. It's sticking on this concept of simplified language, whether the language is confusing or not. I just to start off with directly to what Mr. Williams was saying. I'd like to just, as everyone knows around this table, we're dealing with a subset of non-infringing uses when we're here. We're not talking about infringing uses, we're really around the table talking about only what types of non-infringing uses we're going to allow. So that's
I think we're trying to look at a category of uses and determine within that category whether they were likely to be non-infringing in part, right? So that explains whether some of the distinctions in the current exemption, and we're exploring whether it might be appropriate to drop some of those and maintain the registered recommendation that they're likely to be non-infringing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that came up at the last hearing, and it's a great moment to sort of explore that. I guess what I'd say in response to that is that on a day-to-day basis, I work with a variety of folks. They could be podcasters, they could be YouTubers, they could be documentary filmmakers, they could be fictional filmmakers, and the question is, all of these folks, when they use a clip, the analysis happens on each individual clip. There's never a situation where someone sends me a video with clips and I say, oh, those 8 clips that you used are generally well within the bounds of fair use, right? Or this type of thing. So you have to really, each clip has to be analyzed. And so that's how a real fair use analysis happens. And so that particular question, I think, is a really challenging one to engage in, to say, well, because on a day-to-day basis, there are folks who are doing a variety of things, a variety of different types of videos, and individual uses can be fair use or not within fair use, regardless of the type of, regardless of if it's a documentary, or regardless of if it's a YouTube video or some other format. So I guess just to continue the thought, though, about filmmakers and confusion, I think what we're trying to avoid is this sort of haplessly violating the law when folks are simply making a video on a day-to-day basis. And there's a variety of ways it can be confusing to folks, right? There's folks who can misidentify themselves as included in a particular category, folks who can misidentify themselves as not included. There are folks who are, what's fascinating nowadays, and I think we benefit so much in this proceeding in 2018 from 18 years of proceedings, 7 proceedings now. And we can look back and we can see that there are, and one of the things that's evolved is many filmmakers, unlike 18 years ago, do a variety of different formats, right? So they're not just a documentary filmmaker. They may also do fictional, they may also do other types of filmmaking. So what's fascinating is somebody could make a documentary film and they could fall within the documentary film exemption, but they could turn around the next day, right, and use the clip in a way that might be fairly strongly fair use, yet be excluded. And so what we're trying to deal with the streamlined exemption is to try to include the folks that have been included, deal with some of the gaps that are there. And I don't think that just providing some examples of activities that are okay is gonna help, because we still have all these additional layers we've added. And what happens is, folks can either haplessly or they have to work with their lawyer to sort of interpret things that many times have never been actually developed in case law. So some of these things have never really been, I don't think
So
that
the
they're.
Copyright Office has said that we're not looking to break new ground on areas of fair use. If it's not developed in case law, there's not examples, how would the office have regulatory authority to bottom the exemption in the way you're requesting?
I'm sorry, the first part.
It's not supported by case law, and if there's not examples, how would the office go about this project?
If what's not supported by case law.
You just said that there may be examples that there's not case law tied to it, and you can't necessarily point to specific uses. So then it becomes a little tricky for us to understand how we could endorse broadly all these limitations. I mean, if someone else wants to jump in.
Oh, well, I think
Mr.
that-
Lerner, I guess.
Oh, sure, and I just have one more thing to say to that, I guess, which is, obviously, you've got 8 renewed exemptions where folks have said that that they need to use motion picture clips. You have these expanded exemptions where there's a good record, particularly in the fictional filmmaking. And so the idea that there needs to be evidence regarding harm, absolutely, but the idea that those criteria need to be included and be extra sort of limiters within the statute, isn't really even, in fact, in the 2015 recommendation, I'll leave it here, you all quote back to the 2000, quote back to the 2000 recommendation, and in that recommendation, there's actually specific calling out, and I'm speaking specifically to our streamlined exemption, where it says, the House Commerce Committee literally says, maybe motion pictures and audiovisual works might be a bit, might not be the appropriate class, but motion pictures could be in the appropriate category. And by the way, they go on in the next sentence or two to talk about the fact that what wouldn't be appropriate is to go too narrow talking about westerns and comedies and other particular types of genres. And so in terms of whether it's statutorily allowed, I think we've put a lot on the record as to why it is. And I think that's evidence-wise, we have a lot of evidence from all the parties who are participating in trying to renew and expand various video-related exemptions that I think supports that as well.
Thank you. So Mr. Loris, to follow you, and then we'll go to Mr. Williams, we're trying to sort of form a discussion back and forth, so we realize you can make.
And Mr. Lerner, if you could also, because it's kind of related to what Mr. Neal was talking about, is just that, Congress has mandated that for the exemptions, the particular class of work should be narrow in focus. So I want to understand if we were to eliminate distinctions based, basically we're talking about all audiovisual works essentially, how is that going to be a focused and sufficiently narrow class under our regulatory authority?
Well, I think that restricting to short portions for purposes of criticism and commentary and the other restrictions without having this.
But that goes to how the work is going to be used. It doesn't go to the class of work itself. And that is what we have to really focus on for it to be sufficiently narrow.
Sure, but if you said motion pictures that are then restricted in use and in other ways, for example, short portions, I don't have notes right in front of me, but short portions, criticism and commentary, you have a glass motion pictures that is then narrowed in those ways. And I think that absolutely passes muster both under the plain language of the statute and what Congress asked, or what Congress said in legislative history, in my view. I also want to just say two points I think are really important points to make here. We are not actually asking you today to break new ground when it comes to these uses. These are criticism and commentary, and it is not a controversial proposition to say that many fan works are fair use because they make criticism and commentary. The Register is on the record recognizing this in previous proceedings in the context of the non-commercial bidders exemption. Bidding is a form of fan work. It's comment, it's saying, I'm going to play with the material, I'm going to remix the material, I'm going to juxtapose different characters, different things, different themes in order to say something new. We're not talking about, in the acts in our case, just writing a sequel. We're talking about someone saying, I'm gonna critique Harry Potter or whatever by showing something, elucidating something about that particular work, right? So again, the register's on the record for this, but also there's numerous cases supporting this proposition that many fan works are fair use. We talked about this last year, so I'll be very quick. We have already our Oaks versus Warner Brothers case about Harry Potter lexicon, Gone with the Wind case.
But
Trust-
for that case,
yeah.
actually, it wasn't, all of it was not fair use, because there were poems
Sure.
about, so just
Sure.
go ahead, but just to be clear that that's not an example of
Yes,
saying that
yes.
fan fiction is always fair use.
No, I'm not saying fan fiction is always fair use, absolutely not, just as not all excerpts that are gonna be used are fair use. What I'm saying is that many fan works are fair use, and I think that's the proposition that is, I don't think it's controversial given the case law and the record. Numerous cases, so we got Harry Potter, you're absolutely right. The court said this is fair use, this is appropriate, but in this case, there was too much reproduction. That worked out great for the public and for the ultimate resolution, because what happened, my understanding is that the author republished the book according to the court's instructions, and no litigation ensued. But then there's also this SunTrust versus Rulemaking. I also want to address something that Matt said about the way that we have given or offer examples of fair use. Filmmakers come into our offices, Mr. Neal, myself, Mr. Donaldson, come into our office and say, I want to do something. They sit down with us and we say, okay, here's how you do it, here's what it works, here's a 3-step test, we use a 3-step test, we also use, of course, the 4 factors, section 107. When we come out of that, we have a much more closely articulated, clear example.
Sure, but not everyone is necessarily given that guidance by a specific person. They're just looking at the regulatory language, and you are talking, specifically in the fan fiction, like examples. So you have the Dr. Seuss Enterprises versus comic mix, where you had like the mashup of Star Trek and Dr. Seuss, which was found, although it's transformative, it was not fair use because of the adverse effects on the derivative market. And you had Ms. Tandy in the previous hearing testifying when I asked her about fan fiction and commenting criticism. She said all fan fiction is, commenting. And so that's not really the case here. And I think we are having to identify, maybe perhaps you can give us more guidance on, if there is a specific type of use here that is sometimes fair use and sometimes not, like where do we draw the line? And especially if you want to eliminate, distinctions based on use and user, that becomes even more complicated, it seems.
Sure. So, our contention is that some portion of fan works are fair use. That is what we have said in the record. We're not as a party.
I don't think anyone's disputing that as much as how do we identify them so that we can categorically write regulatory language so that we are incorporating those types of fan fiction.
Sure. So I think you can say, are you providing criticism and commentary? What are you elucidating? What new meaning to Will Campbell, new meaning and expression are you adding with this fan?
But you also, but like in the Dr. Seuss example I gave, it's not just whether or not it's transformative, it's whether or not there's an effect on the derivative market. So how are you providing that type of advice, if at all, or how should people look to,
Yeah, and to that point, why should we drop the non-commerciality limitation if that's seems like that might be relevant to how a transformative work might affect the derivative market?
Well, I will defer to Mr. Neal and Ms. Rosenblatt on that question of non-commerciality. Getting back to the question of effect on the market, I think in most of these cases, there is not an effect on the market. A lot of these uses are permitted, and the question is, I think if something is sufficiently transformative, numerous courts have said that does trump the market.
That's actually not, the Supreme Court has numerous times said that the fourth factor, the effect on the market, is the most important factor. And I just referenced a case where it was transformative. So again, the question is, we can't just look at, whether or not something is transformative. We also have to look at the commercial effects of that work. And so my question is, how can we provide enough guidance and regulatory language so that we're not crossing one line into the other type of infringing
I think
work?
the best way to do that is to say, is it first of all, if someone is crossing that line, even if they are able to take advantage of the DMCA, there's still a remedy for fair use. So I think that takes care of itself that way. But also, a remedy for you can bring an action for copyright infringement. So now you're just.
Sure, but we're trying to get into the point where I don't think anyone here wants anyone to have infringing use. And so my question is, how can we provide guidance
Sure.
and regulatory language so that they don't cross that line?
Well,
Not whether or not they can go and be sued later.
I think that, I think that the best answer to that, in addition to what I said previously, one, I think that by restricting it to short portions, that does make a real dent in this potential issue that you're identifying. And the other one I think is that, it's not going to match perfectly necessarily, but that is okay because there is a remedy for copyright infringement, right? So I think you could say short portions is in there, and that is going to cut down on the kind of harm that my understanding of opposition is mostly worried about, which is copyright, which is counterfeiting and that kind of thing. And I would also say that perhaps you could say an articulable criticism and commentary, for example. I would not go much further than that, because then what you're going to be doing is adding more restrictions even than for documented filmmaking or something like that. But again, I think this is mostly a phantom threat. I think this is not something that is realistically going to happen. If someone is going to be committing copyright infringement, and they've ripped in order to commit copyright infringement that they are claiming is criticism and commentary, you have statutory damages to the tune of $100,000 as opposed to $3,500 on the DMCA.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep these a little short because we are really a little short on time. Mr. Williams, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, this kind of discussion about how we got here and why there are certain categories of users, historically, the reason for that is as I think you understand, the office was denying these types of requests outright because it could not come to the conclusion that all uses of audiovisual works for fair use or whatever you want to call it was an appropriate class of works. And then the office decided that if it would specify certain categories of users, and that was done at the request of proponents, that maybe it could get there, maybe it could grant some exemptions. And so that's what it's tried to do in order to try to give proponents who were willing to categorize a specific type of use in a specific way an exemption. But when you try to disregard the current boundaries, that effort falls apart and it gets a lot closer to all uses of motion pictures for fair use purposes, which is not an appropriate class of works. And as you're discussing, there are multiple opinions, some of them quite recent, like TV Eyes, that say even if it's transformative, you still have to look at the fourth factor, and there still is potential market harm. And I think that process has to almost be done twice in the context you're operating in. First, they have to establish that there are a significant number of non-infringing fair uses, and part of that is looking at the fourth factor, potential harm. And even if you get to the conclusion that, well, there are a significant number of potentially fair uses here, even if, as you said before, a lot of things in the fan fiction world are infringing for a variety of reasons, it's often very hard to perceive what the parodic or criticism, the parodic purpose of criticism is. They often use full songs without licenses. But even if you can decide that some of them are not infringing, under Section 1201, you then have to look at, well, if we grant this because there's some non-infringing uses, what's the potential harm to copyrighted works under the 4 1201 factors? And the fact that there are licensing options for fictional filmmakers and for fictional ebook authors and potential markets in other spaces, it comes into play once again. And so I think that's why you've drawn the lines the way you have, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And in Washington, we talked about what does criticism and comment mean? Is it criticism and comment about the specific work that's being copied, or is it something broader? And I think Jack's response was it needs to be much broader than that. And while I wouldn't say that it's never fair use to make criticism and comment in a broader context, that under all of the cases is a harder sell than when you're criticizing the work directly. And I think that's why you've included the types of works you have, because they're the types of works that are speaking about the things being commented on specifically. And these other categories, the examples in the record, while a lot of them are very interesting, they don't include commentary about the work itself.
Vice Chair Rosenblatt, if you want to talk about that, and in particular, it'd be helpful for us to understand, so maybe there's almost two projects. There's whether it is appropriate or necessary to clarify the existing exemptions as they are, and also whether they should be broadened, which you can see those projects somewhat overlapping. But if there's examples of things which are not included that need to be included as part of that, that can be helpful.
Sure. So thank you for that. I think one of the chief confusions, to sort of return to the question about what are people confused about at all, one of the chief confusions, and I think Art alluded to this, is that people are confused about whether they fit into the type of creator category that distinguishes between these existing exemptions. And so we're not actually here to litigate remix video, as you know, but rather to talk about sort of where other things might fit in, like multimedia ebooks, and also like, for example, uses that attorneys might make in litigation. So there's a great example. It becomes quite famous. That there's a documentary about it of somebody who was exonerated by footage showing that they were at a baseball game during the time when they were alleged to have committed this capital crime. Or things like makeup tutorials, or things like YouTube reviews of movies. Right? So where do things fit in? There's a great example. I just came across yesterday a makeup tutorial that juxtaposes someone's face to a bit from a movie. Right? Is that remix video? It's certainly, I think, a use for criticism and commentary. It's using a short portion. Also not included, but something that people have struggled with, is audio-only uses of audiovisual works. Increasingly, we see podcasters who want to rip to get high-quality audio, because people expect high-quality audio in podcasts.
Could you provide, point us to examples of these ebooks or podcasts that might not fall under the current remix exemption, but that which people want to do? Because I will say, like this morning I went to look onto the Ren piece, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and it was a lot of anime material, so I didn't really see an example of uses, and I don't really see any submissions of, here's my pitch, here's what I'm planning to do, and I can't do it.
So I think we can point to those. I think we would do that in another submission because I don't have them off the top of my head. But I also think that part of what's happening is there are a lot of questions about this rather than concrete examples. So, for example, on Quora, you've got a question that says, is it illegal to use the audio for a movie trailer in my podcast? Right? And the answers are all over the map. Their Audacity, which is a podcasting, sound editing software, right, where people on forums say, well, if I want to get high quality audio, I have to rip first because Audacity won't let me put this in, right? So it's not specific, right? I don't have specific podcast examples off the top of my head, but I have examples of people making these questions. And that's something that we could certainly make a follow-up submission on if that's something you're interested in. I'd also say here, you asked about so what can be done to clarify in a way that doesn't open this up to all uses of clips for fair use, which I understand isn't where you want to go with this. And so I think right now we have the short portions limitation in there. We have the it must be fair use limitation in there. We have the criticism and commentary limitation in there. And right now, the existing exemption has nothing in it that addresses factor 4. If you wanted to address factor 4, we could take a cue from Canada's fair dealing exemptions and say that does not usurp the market of the copyright holder, and include that in an exemption, right? More closely track something specific. So I think there are ways of making it clear that don't involve sort of chilling things that are likely to be fair uses, but aren't enumerated.
Would one way
right
to
now.
do that, would it be possible to, rather than making it completely eliminating use or user, but maybe to exclude certain uses? Would
I'm
that-
not sure I understand the question.
So right now, basically, like you kind of have the use and user dictating whether or not an exemption can be used, and you're saying that that should be eliminated. Our question is if it's possible, if there are certain types of uses that fall more into the infringing side, if there's a way to identify those and to exclude those types of uses in regulatory language, which would provide more guidance, but it also might address some of the concerns of opponents.
Yeah, so I want to clarify, I think we're not actually arguing to eliminate use and user, we're arguing to eliminate user. But that in fact, right, limitations on the kind of use are something that we feel comfortable with.
Well, you kind of are, because you're talking about, you're eliminating, we're not talking about filmmaking anymore, we're not, so I feel like when I'm talking about use, like that's kind of, I think, how I'm envisioning
I see.
it.
Okay.
So you're basically essentially collapsing all of that, so my question is, if there's a way to identify specific use, which is maybe more problematic, which maybe is like on the gray area, which would maybe fall more on the infringing side, if there's a way to identify that, to exclude that type of use in regulatory language, which might provide more guidance.
This may not be a very satisfying answer, but I actually think the things that are unlikely to be fair use are actually things that are unlikely to use short clips.
Well, no one's asked to take that limitation out, so is there another way to add some other type of language?
Sure, but that's sort of where I'm going with this is, I think we may, to a large extent, already have gotten there when we have these.
But the opponents have said that it's basically not enough, so my question is if there's a way to maybe, without completely broadening it to include all users and use, to make it like a little bit more finite in a different way.
I wonder if you could also, maybe another way to think about it is Mr. Williams keeps pushing the certain language, which now Mr. Taylor has said they like that. Do you think that would simplify the project? They had a submission of a sample language in their opposition, or I think the office exploded, what about separating out educational uses on the one hand and derivative uses on the other, so it's a little more usable to the non-lawyers who are looking to engage in it?
I think separating educational from derivative uses is not unreasonable, but I also think that it's actually really hard to separate those because a lot of derivative uses are educational,
It might not be
so
mutually exclusive, you can say that no longer this, but no longer
Right.
that.
So I can't speak. I actually don't, off the top of my head, have their language, so I don't feel comfortable speaking directly to whether we endorse it. That's something though that
Okay.
we
Just
could return
because-
to.
Thank you. It's because we're getting short on time, we're gonna try to tighten things up, and we do want to talk a lot about, I think, licensing next to. So do any of the proponents wish to comment on the language Mr. Williams pointed to?
Mr. Neal?
I'm sorry, could you just clarify which language you had in?
So they said if you were, the office, I guess, was inclined to simplify it, this is on, it's not on, I don't have the page, but their submission had some proposed language of how to do it, that they say is simpler, although perhaps not as simple as the EFF OTW and Marner proposal.
Sure. I think that language had some problems. I think it was probably at least almost 2.5, 3 times as long as what we proposed. I think that some of the language used in there was a bit beyond what I think makes the language accessible to folks who are not attorneys.
Can you point to any specifics?
I think we already have some on the record in our reply about that, about why that's but I don't have the 332 words in front of me, so I can't at this point. I'm happy to discuss that further, but I can't point to anything at this moment. But I know that for our reply comment, we reviewed that, we spoke about it in our reply comment. I just, it's related to that though. I think, Mr. Williams brought up the fact that you then have to look at what the harm is. And it was interesting that we sort of skipped over quickly what that was sort of, well, I think it's a really, and you were asking sort of how do we better clarify this? How do we better craft this? And I think that part of that determination, it's absolutely a tough thing to do. But I think that it's a really good question to ask. What is the harm that's on the record after so many proceedings? And so
that is a great segue, Mr. Schaffner, I believe. Do you want to speak about what might be your perceived harm if these exemptions were brought in this way?
Sure, Ben Schaffner. So the fourth fair use factor has reared its head over the last few minutes, and I think there's been sort of a theme running through some of the proponents' presentations that there's really not a viable licensing market in some of these areas for clips. And I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about that licensing market and providing some follow-up.
And I definitely want you to do that. I think what would be very helpful in that context is because in the 2015 rulemaking, the register noted that the record at that time did not suggest that licensing was a viable alternative. And so I think if you could speak to why the market has changed since that rulemaking, I think, and how you are going to talk right now, I think it would just be helpful to kind of have that context.
And I think it's also tied to specific uses too, so think about that, right? There's some words where there is a licensing market and there's some places where there may not.
Yeah, I should clarify that it was not a viable option for purposes of comment and criticism. That's where.
Sure. So, and just as a preface to what I'm about to discuss, let me just say the MPA represents 6 major movie studios, and it's a little bit more complicated than that because each of these major studios have different divisions. They might have a movie studio, they have a television studio, some of them have news organizations. In some of those companies, the clip licensing function is centralized. In others, they will have actually different clip licensing functions for those different divisions. And the studios all have different sort of philosophies and business practices as to licensing. So I'm going to be speaking in sort of generalities and in the aggregate, but I think there's still some important takeaways. Overall, every single one of the 6 studios that we represent licenses clips. They all have websites that you can go to, get information about how to do this. And in most cases, it can be all done online, either through forms that they make available, through email. They all provide phone numbers. One thing I wanted to address, I think it come up in one of the filings or possibly in DC, is that there was the argument that one of the studios only conducted these licensing negotiations or interactions by fax. I think there was a reference in an old FAQ to a fax number, but if you actually look sort of more comprehensively at the website, you'll see that there's actually email and phone as well. So there's no fax only.
Can we talk about? I think there was testimony in DC that some of the requests get ignored, particularly if there's sort of smaller users or low dollar value, that it's not really a market that the studios, as varied as they are, may be interested in pursuing.
Sure. So I did go back and sort of survey all 6 of the studios to address some of those issues. So one point was, I think there was the representation or the argument made by some of the proponents in DC that some of the studios, have a policy that they do not license to individuals. They only license to other businesses. And here's what I found. None of the companies have a policy where they refuse to license to individuals. Now, as a practical matter, the vast majority of licenses are issued to businesses. They are the ones that sort of have the wherewithal. If they're engaged in a project, it's usually not just an individual who says, I'm going to produce a documentary or a movie or a TV show. They are part of a company. So the vast majority of license requests do come from from business entities. Nonetheless, they do from time to time receive requests from individuals. I will say that in a significant portion of those cases, the individual is simply not able to afford the price of the license. That doesn't mean there is not a viable market. I mean, I was thinking about how to address this, and to give you a brief sort of analogy, just north of here is the neighborhood of Bel Air, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Los Angeles. There's a very viable real estate market there. People every day sell houses for $5 and $10 and $15 million a piece. I can't participate in that market. I can't afford that. They won't even let me in the door because they usually, require proof of funds before they'll even show you the house. Now, I can't participate in that market, but that doesn't mean there's not a viable real estate market in Bel Air.
Take through some of the uses that we're talking about here to see whether there's a market, like is there licensing to remix artists, perhaps commercial remix artists, right? Something that wouldn't be included, or what about multimedia ebooks, or things like fictional uses that are sort of, we're being asked to grant an exemption for on the grounds that there's some of these uses are likely to be fair, or many of them may be likely to be fair. How should we think about the 107 analysis when evaluating those?
Sure. So there is licensing in all of those categories that you mentioned. Some of them more than others. I mean, for example, ebooks.
Are the criteria the same for the types of licenses?
Again, it's really hard to generalize because all 6 studios, and even within those studios, may have different policies. But again, none of them said, we have an absolute policy, we will not issue licenses in those areas.
Do you know if it's a frequent occurrence? Is it something material to the business?
I would say, I can't represent to you that it's a frequent occurrence in those specific categories. People make the comment, for example, that ebooks is a sort of a nascent market. There have been licenses issued for ebooks, but again, it's a relatively new thing. There's some experimentation going on. There are licenses issued in that. If you look at some of the form licenses that are available on the websites, they'll talk about things like all uses, and all means all. So there's no restriction or no prohibition against issuing licenses in some of these categories. I just said there are it's relatively unusual for licenses to be issued to individuals. However, one thing that's not terribly unusual is, say, remix videos that are posted to YouTube. Some of those may be fair uses, some of them may not be. But for example, the Content ID system in YouTube is able to identify, works that are owned by our studios and monetize that. Those are not individually negotiated licenses, but the effect is that a lot of those uses, including a lot of uses that are not fair uses, are licensed. Even though, again, it's not A going to B and saying, may I please have a license?
So is that an example then of maybe an alternative to getting a license? I mean, then why, it seems like in some instances you're okay with not licensing material because you're still able to make money on it.
Well, I mean,
what I'm understanding.
It's a non-traditional kind of license. I mean, you might think of a traditional license as, the...
Is it really a license, or are you just making money from their use?
Well, it essentially, there's a license agreement with YouTube. It's a little bit complicated because there's multiple entities involved. There's a license agreement between the studio and the copyright owner and YouTube that essentially tolerates certain uses. And I think that's actually, there's a broad category of uses on YouTube and other places that are probably not fair uses that nonetheless our studios tolerate because the cost of enforcement is too high to go after those, even if in the aggregate it would have some substantial monetary effect. Or there's this mechanism, which is, again, a sort of new business model where the work is identified and essentially a license is granted to YouTube in order to allow that use, even if it otherwise might have been infringed.
Can we ask you a couple more factual questions about the licensing market? Do you have a sense for the overall size, either on an individual or aggregate cases for the studios?
Yeah, so I can represent that in the aggregate, the studios issue several thousand clip licenses a year. I'm not able to give you much of a breakdown, again, because there's the way that different studios conduct their own businesses. So I can't tell you how many of those are fiction versus nonfiction versus educational, et cetera, but in the aggregate, several thousand clip licenses per year.
And you have a sense of the monetary value,
I can't give you a number.
right? But you think each of those licenses would hit each of those buckets, but you're not sure what proportion?
Yes, there are licenses issued for fictional films, for non-fictional films, for documentaries, for ebooks, and for educational uses.
Do you know, given, this is a filmmaking specific question, but Mr. Lerner's submission has a variety of films or short films, I guess, and indexed films that they would like to make that are fictional uses of clips, whether the studios you represent have been approached to license any of those?
I can't tell you off the top of my head whether those specific examples in Mr. Lerner's submission, whether they were actually approached.
Do you have a, you may not know this either, but do you have a sense for whether in of all those examples, a non-disparagement clause would have prevented the licensing of the clips?
Yeah, so again, I can't answer that as to the specific examples. I mean, there are examples in the record of the foreign licenses to include those non-disparagement clauses. I obviously don't deny that. What I would say is that the non-disparagement clauses have been discussed in the last several cycles. The office or the technical library nonetheless issued regulations that, after having heard evidence about those, I'm not aware of any change in the record since the previous cycle, so I'm not sure what the justification would be for sort of giving different weight
I
to
think
the.
we're being asked to consider different types of uses, different films that people want to make. So we're looking at different projects. So
Yeah.
if you have any opinions on those.
Well, again, they're there. Those are in the record. I would say that one other thing I say though is that this is not. It's not really an issue about 1201 itself. This is a contractual issue. So if it was something,
But if I guess how is it an alternative to circumvention if their use that they want to make is prohibited under the contract?
Right.
So then it really is no longer, so I think we're trying to ask these questions to see whether or not it's really a feasible alternative.
yeah. So I don't think there's much evidence in the record that these non-disparagement clauses, which are vestiges and have probably existed in these contracts for many, many decades, have had any substantial impact on people's ability to make fair uses.
Can you flip the question another way, and if the proponents were to get the exemption they requested, is that likely to have, what effect is that likely to have on the market for copyrighted works or the availability of copyrighted works from your perspective?
Well, again, the clip licensing market is a real market. It's not the biggest part of this. I won't represent it. It's the biggest part of the studio's revenue stream, but it's a significant revenue stream. The studios all have people this is their job. They license clips. I do think it's important. In the fair use analysis, the defendant will always make the argument. It's just this one little clip and this one work, which is not the biggest deal in the world. That's not going to have any impact on the revenue of a multi-billion-dollar movie studio. But that's not how the fair use analysis works under the law. The law says you have to look at if in the aggregate this kind of activity were permitted, would that have a substantial effect on the market? And I think it absolutely would. I mean, the clip licensing revenue would simply dry up if all of this kinds of activity, if all fan uses, if all
But we're not actually, I mean, just in fairness, we're not talking about like all uses,
Right.
right? We're specifically talking about clips for what arguably would be fair use because for purposes of comment and criticism, and the proponents in the previous hearings talked about, well, if a use is fair use, then why should I have to pay to license something if it's fair use? So I don't know if you have a response to that.
Well-
Because really, there's no market, right? They're saying if I don't need to get a license to it, we're not really affecting the market by not getting licensed and engaging in fair use.
Right, but I think as Mr. Williams pointed out a few minutes ago, the section 1201 itself requires that you look at and say, well, even if certain uses might be fair, would allowing the exception sort of cause substantial harm to the market? And I mean, I do think it's fair to say we also need to look in the aggregate. The more and more and broader the exceptions, the more sort of normalized the activity of breaking DRM becomes, that overall has a significant impact on the studio's willingness to sort of engage in new business models, et cetera. I mean, I know you heard testimony in DC, and I think you'll hear it again tomorrow from Representative Disney, who's going to be talking about some of the new business models. The studios, when they decide to enter any of these new business models, whether it be things, like Movies Anywhere or any of these new online distribution platforms, they are asking, can we keep the works protected? Can we keep the works protected? And
Sure, but also one of your new business models is the YouTube one, right? Which is arguably they're not really being protected in the traditional way that maybe you would be with Movies Anywhere. So I guess my question is, in terms of like monetizing like the YouTube business model versus your traditional clip licensing, if you have an idea which makes more and like how much more, or like maybe as a percentage of the YouTube market that you're, I don't know what a percentage of the entire.
Yeah, unfortunately, I really don't have sort of monetary statistics that I can cite to you about the size of these particular markets, but I mean, again, I think the overall point is that the more and more you expand the ability to rip DRM, to break DRM, the less effective a tool for protection of copyrighted works it becomes, and the less willing studios are to engage in new licensing practices, new business models that do depend on the protection of those statutes.
And so one more follow-up question on that. In 2015, there was a gentleman from Fox, and he wasn't able to provide specifics, I guess, about the effect that granting a broader exemption or granting any exemption in that case would have had on the piracy of works. Are you able to say anything more on that? How real is this price?
It's hard to answer sort of that general question, and I think people use the word piracy in
I guess
different
preferring
ways.
as opposed to I could have gotten a license and then submitted a legal license. Right?
I'm sorry, so-
Well, on the one hand, we've been talking about for the specific use of the clip, they could have gotten a license and maybe some people won't, right? And it might not be fair use. It's, I guess, one potential effect on the availability of copyrighted works or the exploitation of it. And then secondly, is there a concern that there is piracy of, I guess, entire movies, or is that anything separate that we should be looking at when we're considering the availability of copyrighted works?
Well, I do think it's fair. I mean, it's this point that I made a couple of minutes ago about sort of normalization of the ripping activity. I mean, as has been pointed out before, I mean, the office has said that the exemptions need to remain narrow and focused, and the broader and less focused they become, the more it becomes not sort of a specialized activity to rip for a specific purpose. But, so the word gets out that, ripping DRM is a totally legitimate thing to do whenever you want to engage in something that you think you should be able to get to do. And I think, one of the reasons that we come here and argue not to make the exemptions broader and less focused every year is that we are concerned about the exceptions swallowing the rule. And pressure building for making it easier and easier and easier to rip, or to break DRM, which again has an impact on the studio's decision-making process and whether to engage in certain distribution models.
Okay, and it sounds like there's nothing quantifiable.
It's difficult to quantify. It's difficult.
Okay, Mr. Neal, you had your comment for that.
Thanks. So yes, in past proceedings, this discussion about piracy came up, and piracy was discussed generally, but just reemphasizing, we haven't seen direct evidence why an educator or an artist or a filmmaker's use of a short clip is going to create piracy. It's interesting that if you focus in on what the harm is then, that's being mentioned as being concerned about, so the joint creators, movie studios are able to make money off of infringing uses through YouTube, so we talked about that, okay? But nobody here is talking about, again, infringing uses. We are, as was mentioned, we're talking about non-infringing uses. And so the question is, there's basically a unidentified harm that there's an unsubstantiated harm that's claimed from folks who are making non-infringing uses. And if there's any harm that's claimed, it's the harm that we as folks that are movie studios can't get a license from folks who are making otherwise non-infringing uses.
Well, what about I believe Mr. Lyons wants that is like under the fourth, like 1201 statutory factors, so it's not even just the fact that it's not infringing fair use, but we also have to consider kind of a second time, like if there's going to be an adverse effect on the market. So like what about the effect on the derivative works market or on the motion clip licensing market? So are you saying that there isn't an adverse effect, or I just don't know what your response would be?
I imagine Professor Lerner has had this experience, but I've worked with folks who have both unlicensed and licensed clips in their film. So you certainly have folks who do both, and so there are certainly folks who are, when a use is considered maybe not appropriate to qualify, or if we think it'd be a better idea to get a license, that certainly happens. So those licensing markets are, they're available to folks who want to make uses that would be otherwise infringing. The question is, why are we concerned about making sure that folks will license a non-infringing use? That's the question. And we have, I think, as Betsy mentioned, when you look at our proposal, the streamlined proposal, there are some specific efforts we make. And as far as this idea that there's going to be some sort of slippery slope, that folks are going to suddenly say, oh my gosh, there's so much, it's suddenly totally fine to use DRM. Our language is linguistically, the words are almost identical to past, I just point out they're almost identical to past exceptions, but for the removal of the user and the sort of similar access controls language. And that's been around now since at least 2009, the first ones, right? So it's been 9 years, and we don't, I don't think there's any evidence that's been offered that there has been some slippery slope, that there's some vast expansion in user privilege.
Thank you. So, we're running out of time. I'm just warning everyone out, and we're still going to try to zigzag. So, Mr. Williams and Mr. Lerner.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to follow on a few of the things that have been discussed. So one of the questions was, are licenses available to individuals? And I think, as he said, there's no studio policy against that. We do have some specific sites in the record that when you go to them, NBC archive site, the CNN site, a number of the other sites, they don't ask you to verify that you're a registered corporation or anything like that before they issue a license. So there is evidence of that market. In addition to that, as we were discussing with the Dr. Seuss comic mix case, there is case law that says that even if a plaintiff doesn't have evidence that it has entered the mashup market, that it is still a potential market as long as it's licensed other types of uses of its work. And so that, I think, plays into your analysis. On the ebooks category specifically, a number of the sites that we refer to do have publishing as a category, or do have all media uses as a category.
Can you get just publishing, like, you know, if you don't need to buy all uses, can you buy just for an ebook or just for a podcast?
So there are some of the sites that specifically have publishing as a category. I think in other instances, you would probably have to call the phone numbers and talk to the people, but in every instance, that is available, either phone numbers or direct personal email addresses.
Do you know if it's available, but I assume there'd be a price differential, if you don't want to exploit the property and as many media, it would go down.
I suspect that's true. I mean, I think the questions about price, although completely valid, and about aggregate revenues, although completely valid, are very difficult to answer when you're representing a number of different competitors who treat that information as proprietary. So it's hard to get into the very specific numbers. But yes, I suspect that's true. And if you go on the CNN and NBC archive sites, for example, it will give you a price almost immediately for almost any type of different use that you plug in for a specific clip. So you actually get a pop-up window, you select the clip, you say, here's the uses I want. I think in some instances, the category of use might just say all uses, depending on the clip at issue, but you can do that, and then there's the follow-up phone numbers or email addresses.
Mr. Williams,
Yes.
if I can interrupt just a second, I don't want to make you lose your train of thought, but in those clips, those are clips that are already on the website. Can the individuals that are coming to the studio say, I would like to make fair use of this 30-second clip. I don't see it on your website. Can I use that? Is that service available in this clip service that you're talking about?
Yes, so these websites are interactive sites that I think are designed to make it as user-friendly as possible. Not every copyright owner has one, but there are a number in the record. They also have contact points on the same websites. So if you don't find what you're looking for, you follow up with someone else. Whether in every instance each studio would agree to go find the clip that you're looking for. I mean, it depends, I guess, on how much information you can provide about what you want versus you just saying, well, I'm kind of hoping to find a clip that has so-and-so in it from 6 years ago. I don't know what each studio would do in response to those individualized requests, but they do make contact points available frequently. They'll segregate them by business unit and by copyright owner, because as Ben was saying, the news division might be different from the studio that's involved in narrative filmmaking, might be different from the studio involved in producing television production series. So they do segregate those out as necessary. On ebooks, I just wanted to emphasize that this is a market that the studios are already in. There's a lot of enhanced edition ebooks. There's not as many as maybe you would expect at this point, given it's been an idea that's been out there for a long time, but there are a number I can point you to. A few of these are in our comments, a few of them aren't. There's an enhanced edition Harry Potter series. There's an enhanced edition Game of Thrones series. Those don't necessarily use clips from the actual motion pictures. They introduce kind of new animation that's alongside the fiction, but you could easily imagine them deciding they want to put clips from the actual motion pictures in them. There's an enhanced edition Roots book that contains a bunch of archival footage of the author and him participating in interviews from the kind of controversial time around when that came out. There's a Making of Star Wars series that has interviews with the cast, all kinds of things of that nature. Nicholas Sparks writes romance novels, and several of them have been made into movies. There are enhanced editions of those. And then one thing I think is important is, so there's a Making of Indiana Jones series that I don't think yet has become an enhanced edition series, but it's full of stills, and still shots have always been licensed for publishing uses by the studios, and enhanced editions are just the next step as technology improves, as they find the right partners to work with, the right publishers, the right authors. It's a market they're going to be in. So they, I think, as the copyright owner, unless certain circumstances arise, have the right to choose who they want to partner with and who they want to license to. Just quickly, because I know we're out of time, but there are a number of things said. With Content ID, and I'm not speaking on behalf of each studio, my view of those licenses is they're licenses to YouTube, not to the individual end users. And whether that is monetized or not is not something that we can say across the board is true. Each individual copyright owner that participates in Content ID gets to select between monetization, monitoring, or blocking. Then they also have to respond, of course, if there's a counter notice from the user claiming that they shouldn't have to do any of those things. And so what each studio does as a business practice, I can't tell you about, and all of those agreements with YouTube are highly confidential, but the fact that program has been made available by one website provider to try to address some of the concerns of copyright owners about the mass numbers of uses out there isn't indicative of a lack of any harm. There's tons of other websites out there that these videos are on that don't provide that kind of copyright owner response system. The proponents tried to say that, well, if we only license thousands of uses per year, but there are thousands per week on YouTube, that somehow that means there's no harm or that our practices are insignificant. I don't think that's the case. Just because there's lots of unauthorized use doesn't mean that there's a lack of harm or that the studios aren't trying to enter a certain market. With respect to the piracy statistics, again, my clients don't have a straight line of sight into who is claiming to exercise an exemption, into who might have gotten a license but decided not to because of the exemption. In the Cesar Chavez example, my understanding is that some things were licensed, some were not. I don't know the basis for how those decisions were made or whether without the exemption there would have been a license. I'm moving quickly with I want to. With non-disparagement agreements, as Ben said, they were in the record last time. I don't think it's entirely the case that there are new uses as categories presented, because all of the things that are being requested last time or being requested this time were actually being requested last time as well, in terms of fictional films, fictional ebooks, commercial videos. They wanted all of those things and they did not get them. I would say with the filmmakers' statements in the joint filmmakers' comments, I don't think there's any that clearly are prohibited by those non-disparagement clauses. I think there's one that claims to be a parody of the X-Files, but I couldn't tell from the description whether it's a parody or it's not a parody. I couldn't tell why a parody would need a direct clip from a pre-existing motion picture instead of creating a new work that easily relates back. So that one was very unclear to me. The rest of them, I didn't see any direct disparagement of the studios or of even the content. And then the very last thing is I just wanted to make sure I was clear on kind of the fair use fourth factor versus section 1201. I'm not trying to say that if you conclude something is always fair use, then therefore you also have to look at the fourth factor and see whether copyright owners are harmed. I think that would defeat the statute's purpose. What I do think you need to do is, if there are some things that fit into a category that you think are probably fair, but there are also a lot of things that you think probably aren't, you have to look and see, if I grant an exemption in this space, is the spillover going to cause harm to a market? And I think that we've established that.
Market largely being the licensing market.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Lerner, we are running out of time. We'll go a little bit over, but we're.
I will be
seeing that
very quick.
initiative.
I've been watching the clock.
Thank you.
I'm definitely considering that. Just to quickly speak to the non-disparagement point, but I wanted to respond to some things Mr. Scheffner said, which I think are very important. The Universal Clips website, which is cited in Joint Creators Council, page 13, is extremely broad. Requires users not to disparage, criticize, belittle, parody, alter, or otherwise negatively comment on the clip in connection with the use. But there's also, you can't criticize the industry and other things. So this is like the DMCA sort of Damocles that can be asserted any time someone doesn't like a use even after it's been licensed. But I want to get back to some of the things that Mr. Scheffner said. I think it's telling that Mr. Scheffner has just compared the licensing part. market to one of the most exclusive housing communities in this country. That is an apt metaphor. There is a licensing market. Some of our clients use it, but it is not available to everyone. And in fact, like Bel Air, most people cannot access it. And that's why we're here. That's the point of this proceeding. Modern technology has enabled a cornucopia of creativity. So many people can create now, individuals and businesses, and a lot of that is going to be fair use. And 1201 is holding us back. And that's, I think, the point of this proceeding. And let's keep that 30,000-foot view, because I want to ask, how much money have the studios lost due to the existing criticism and commentary-based DMCA exemptions? There's no evidence in the record of any tangible harm to them. In fact, the only articulable harm that the only harm they've articulated here is the threat of a marginal number of erstwhile fair uses that actually turn out not to be fair. And nothing Mr. Scheffner or Mr. Williams have said changes that, or the facts on the ground. Non-expiration clauses exist. Sometimes rights holder, and even if I don't concede that none of our proposed uses would not run afoul of those clauses, but even if they did, they don't represent everyone, and not all uses that people might want to license would meet the standard of non-disparagement clauses. Sometimes rights holders do say no, and a great example of that is one of the members of the MPAA actually had to make fair use in the Steve Jobs film. That was not in the record in 2015. It was not permitted to be in the record because the record had closed. So that's in the record now as Appendix S and Sierra to our comment. So sometimes rights holders absolutely do say no. Sometimes they don't call back. I've observed this personally with a number of clients. The MPAA does not represent every rights holder. In fact, there's a huge orphan works problem, which I know several of you have worked on, and of course we have worked on that as well. And finally, people can't afford licenses. So let's be clear here that the Dr. Seuss case notwithstanding, if a use is sufficiently transformative, you do not need to get a license. And we're not talking about or asking to reduce a legitimate market. In the Campbell case, for example, there were negotiations about a license. Those negotiations broke down. The RAP group used the material anyway, and the Supreme Court said, yes, we are worried about derivative market, particularly replacing the primary market for the work. But the court did say, yeah, they negotiated about a license, like the negotiations broke down, and so now we're going to allow that to go forward. So we're
Right,
not,
they said that can't be held against you in the first factor, and then they remanded it to consider whether there was an effect, and it turned out that there wasn't, I guess, right?
okay. I think the holding that's been cited repeatedly is that you don't have a right to a derivative market for fair use, for transformative use. I think that's it. And finally, I just want to make one more point, because I know we're very short on time. The recommended language by the MPAA, I took a look at that in response. I don't see that changes anything. It looks like it's simply saying this is rewording if you were to simply renew the existing exemption.
I think they were trying to have a straight renewal in a simpler way, if I'm paraphrasing what they were trying to achieve.
I actually think that the existing language would be preferable to that. That was, again, I did not thought deeply about that before this, so forgive me for that. But I think that the current language, if you're going to simply renew the exemption, then just renew the exemption.
Mr. Taylor.
Yes, that actually brings me back to what I wanted to say. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out in our endorsement of joint creators language that our clients want to make clear that it should not include AACS2. And I do want to raise the prospect of simplifying the language to something we discussed during this study, which would be to possibly give us opponents and proponents, everybody, an opportunity to review any language before you actually publish it. And I think that may help in the efforts to actually resolve some confusion and simplify it. And I'll just point out that the current exemption has misidentified AACS, and it has the advanced access control system, and it's actually
I'm sorry, which specific existing exemption?
the current temporary exemptions misidentify it as the advanced access control system as opposed to the advanced access content system. And so if we had been given the opportunity to comment on that before, we could have corrected that. So just a,
We appreciate that, and regardless of anything else, we will probably correct that. Anything else? I actually have one specific question about ebooks, which may really be a question for Ms. Tandy, so I'm looking at whatever you, Professor Rulemaking. Do you know if you were to make a sort of bitter equivalent in the ebooks world, are you remixing the clip? Is the clip itself being edited or having a different song track or sound on it? Does that make sense?
Sorry, can you clarify what you're asking on that?
So she said that remix artists may want to make ebooks, and that's not permitted in the current exemption. And so the current remix video exemption is based on a lot of examples where the video clip itself is edited, either the image or the sound. And if this were to be in an ebook, is the video itself still edited, or is it, you know, unaltered clips with writing? And I guess that context would make it non-infringing would be the theory.
I don't know enough about those kinds of, about the ebooks under discussion to speak to that.
The answer is yes. Sometimes those ebooks would need or want to alter the images themselves or the sound. We've seen examples, for example, I think some anonymous, but they focus in on a particular subpart or split screen or things like that, where they are, for lack of another word, remixing the video as well as juxtaposing it and reordering it.
Thank you, that was my question. So I think this is, if anyone else still wants to speak, we'll let you say your piece, otherwise we will, Mr. Neal.
Just something really quick, since AACS 2.0 was brought up right at the end there. Just a quick point that I just want to reemphasize, this is on the record, but the the current video exemptions and the sort of subclasses that exist, those are the only place that we could find in the record, at least, that call to specific technologies related to anti-circumvention. So when you compare the video exemption to other exemptions, they aren't sort of saying the specific types of technology, and so that's part of the reason. And part of the reason we asked for similar access controls is that we benefit from the hindsight again of seeing the evolution from, VHS wasn't enough, and so we allowed the DVDs, and then DVDs wasn't enough, so there was the allowance of Blu-ray. And so in the record, there's some comments about the fact that AACS 2.0 is somehow different than the other preceding access controls. And while it is a different and higher level of video quality, I think that functionally it's quite similar to, and we benefit from the evolution that we saw in the past.
So thank you, Mr. Carey. We'll let you have the last word.
Yes, I would say, first of all, historically, the technologies have been identified because the content industries have developed these technologies, and that's how the Total I proceeding grew out. The non-copyright industries, particularly where exemptions have been employed, who knows what technologies are at issue there, but we have been able to identify the technologies because of the historic nature of this proceeding. And as far as AAC S2, it is completely different. It serves a completely different format. And as far as historically, this proceeding has given new formats an opportunity to grow before an exemption is ever granted. And in this case, they have made no case to warrant granting of an exemption for ultra high definition Blu-ray.
Mr. Lawrence, do you want to speak about AACS 2? I think we really do have to wrap it up, so.
No, I just wanted to say we look forward to the opportunity to review the videos that were submitted and to respond to them. Thank you.
Mr. Neal, do you have anything?
Yes, I just wanted to say that there are pieces on the record that speak to the evolution of AACS 2.0. I think there was a quick discussion in 2015, and it was more of a developing technology at that point. But I think there are points made on the record that talk about the fact that by 2021, by the next time we're sitting here, over 50% of people are going to have 4K televisions. And so there are points on the record about the demand for 4K. There's certainly points from a filmmaker who is named, Rick Bowman, in our filing, talking about the fact that the big Los Angeles film market, that the only acceptable films from many distributors were only willing to accept a certain level of quality, the 4K quality. So I think that we're also at a different point regarding ACS 2.0 than maybe we were 3 years ago.
Okay, thanks everyone very much.